Hello, and welcome to this Focus on Wellbeing session on sleep. My name's Sarah Phillips, and I'm one of the team working on the National Wellbeing Hub. This session promises to be very interesting, giving you tips on how to improve your sleep. And I want to hand over now to Dr. Dimitri Gavriloff, who's a clinical psychologist and sleep medicine specialist. Dimitri is a clinical engagement lead for Sleepio at Big Health. So over to you, Dimitri.
Thanks, Sarah, and Happy New Year to everyone. I'm going to sneak it in there because I think it's still okay to say Happy New Year, but I know that people have very particular views on when you have to stop saying it. So glad to be here, and thank you very much for having me back again. I hope you're all well and ready to kick off 2022 with some good sleep. We're going to spend probably 20 to 30 minutes today, maybe a little bit more, talking about some basic sleep stuff, and then tips on how to kind of improve your sleep, or maybe just how to get back to sleeping well. And we'll leave some time at the end for questions as well. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time to discuss them. But if you pop your questions into the chat as we go, then members of the team here can collate them as we go, and we can try and sort of aggregate them at the end. So I'll kick off by jumping to the next slide and talking about sleep. So I always start, this is something that for those regular viewers out there of our stuff will know that I start by contextualizing stuff a bit, and it's worth thinking about sleep in its natural context. So sleep is something that we see pretty much in all complex organisms, but we certainly see differences in how things behave during the day and during the night in the absence and presence of light. For example, in plants or bacteria, we see differences in how they do things. It's not sleep, as we would say, in complex organisms, but it is a differentiation. And so if we think about our animal cousins, certainly in our mammalian cousins, we all sleep. There's some mammals here on the screen, and you can see we sleep for different amounts, but these are all kind of averages. And in this kind of group of organisms, you have predators, you have animals that are sort of more prey animals, you have herbivores, carnivores, etc. And you have animals that are relatively big brain relative to their size, you know, and so on and so forth. There doesn't really seem to be any kind of correlation between any of these variables in how much sleep something needs, but you can see that actually the amount of sleep required per species is highly variable, and in fact may happen with a brown bat there, may happen mainly during the day, which is not what we experience as humans. But what we do have as our experience as humans is diurnal activity and nocturnal sleep. So we sleep during the night and we are awake during the day. And you know, I feel like recording a cover of, you know, war, what is it good for? Sleep, what is it good for? Absolutely everything would be the next line, because really sleep is something that has an effect on absolutely every single piece of our physiological machinery, our function. And when we don't get enough sleep, it impacts us negatively across many domains. But you can see here that it is part of when it has a role in our cardiovascular system in terms of metabolism, our metabolic system, the immune system, thermoregulatory system, endocrine system, reproductive system, and more. Emotional reactivities greatly impacted by sleep, as is mood regulation, learning and memory, attention, lymphatic cleaning, which is the kind of janitorial process that goes on in the brain every night. So when we go to sleep, cerebral spinal fluid comes up into the brain and essentially washes out the metabolic waste of the day, and prepares it for the next day, a bit like an office cleaning team might go into an office and clear away all the gunk and coffee cups and stuff that have been left out in order for the office to work optimally the next day. It's also important for things like creativity, decision making, you know, you name it, sleep is important for it. So we've kind of established that sleep is kind of it has an essential function across what we do as humans, and we can think of it a bit like eating, a bit like drinking, breathing. These are things we don't have much choice about. We don't have much opportunity to either do with or without. We either do them or we don't, and we suffer but sleep is one that we tend to get involved with more. So we wouldn't routinely stop ourselves breathing in a particular way. We breathe naturally, and in the same way, sleep is something that we can kind of let it go back to. We would try as much as we can, in general terms, to allow it to go back to how it's just naturally going to take place, rather than tweaking it too much. So what does it look like, this sleep thing that we're talking about? Well, here's a hypnogram. A hypnogram is a sleep diagram. And you can see that across the bottom there, we have this ubiquitous 6 hours. We'll talk about that in a bit. But you also have the stages of sleep. This is an old hypnogram, so it has 4 stages of sleep. We only really have 3 these days, so I've got them on the right-hand side there. But we go from a period of wakefulness into the first stage of sleep, light sleep, which is called non-REM stage 1 sleep. And the non-REM, so non-REM just means non-rapid eye movement sleep, that stage 1 is very short, stage 2 is relatively short, and then we're down into deep sleep, which is that stage 3 sleep, which is quite a lengthy period. So we get this deep sleep at the beginning of the night. We have this notion that the deepest sleep happens closer to morning, but actually the reality is that it's the opposite. We go to sleep, we get the deep sleep that the brain craves, and we're able to sleep through that. The brain is able to have the stuff done, the body's able to have the stuff done that it needs doing, the maintenance bit, and then we're up into lighter sleep again. But we cycle through these sleep stages routinely. This is what's known as sleep architecture. And what's crucial about this is that it happens in a very natural way. We don't have to get involved with it. But you can see there that the pink bits, or the red bits, pertain to what we call REM sleep, so rapid eye movement sleep. This is the sleep that happens at the end, typically at the end of a sleep cycle, and that is really strongly associated with narrative dreaming, with emotional dreaming, emotion processing. And you can see that after those periods of REM sleep, sometimes we also have brief nocturnal awakenings. We wake up very briefly. We might sort of scrabble around a bit in bed and then find a comfortable position, then go back to sleep again. And in fact, that's what most of us do every night. And if we don't care about it, if it's not something that has any meaning for us, we just ignore it, we go back to sleep. And in fact, many people will say, I didn't wake up at all last night, but in fact, they may have done several times and just not realized it. So one of the things to say about sleep is that it is not this deep freeze of consciousness that just kind of goes throughout the night. It's a very dynamic state. And we have periods of lighter deep sleep, we have periods of REM sleep, and then of course we have these punctuated periods of awakening, which are totally normal. The point at which they become kind of problematic is when they become problematic, when they become longer, more protracted periods of waking, from which one finds it difficult to return to sleep. So if they're very brief and they punctuate the night, that's not necessarily, and they punctuate the night sort of relatively infrequently, that's fine, that's normal. So that's what sleep looks like. And how much of it do we need? Well, that's a great question. It depends how old you are, and it depends what stage of life you're in. But it also depends, potentially on what season it is in swing. It depends on how stressful your life is. It depends on lots of things. Broadly speaking, we talk within a range for a particular age group. And you can see there that newborns may need as much as 19 hours in a 24-hour period, which is a huge amount of time, if you think about it. But that kind of gradually reduces to where I find myself now, I'm around 40, there in that bracket, 26 to 64. And you expect someone at that age to sleep for roughly 7 to 9 hours, roughly. Might be a little bit more, and some people might be a little bit less, and some people, that's fine. But the reality is that we'll all have our own sleep need. And if we allow ourselves to sleep naturally without getting involved with it too much, then we tend to kind of have an average. But you can see that even teenagers there, 14 to 17 years old, may still need up to 10 hours sleep a night, some of them, maybe a little bit more, some of them. And so this is actually quite important when we're thinking about how sleep may affect people around us, such as our teenage children or people we know, school children, who may not be able to get enough sleep in the nocturnal period because they have to get up very early and they go to bed very late, which is again a natural thing that happens during adolescence. They begin to get later, their body clocks get later. So we tend to think of it a bit like a shoe size. It's a strange thing to do, to go online and look up, 40-year-old man living in Oxford in the UK, how big should my shoe size be? That's a pretty ridiculous way of doing it. In fact, the best thing to do is go to a shoe shop, try on a couple of pairs of shoes, and then get a sense of how big your shoe size really is, and it will change from brand to brand, presumably. but the idea is that it's my shoe size and I fall within a range. There'll be people at my age and who are in my situation who have slightly different shoe sizes, and that's okay. So one of the most important things to understand, I guess, is about, if we're talking about sleep, is how it works, how it's regulated. So sleep is regulated by what we call the two-process model. And I'm going to simplify it a bit here, but it's fairly straightforward to understand. On the bottom here, we have a 24-hour period, 6 o'clock in the morning, day 1, to 6 o'clock in the morning the next day. In the middle there, we have midnight. And you can see that across the waking period, we develop what we call sleepiness. It's the sleep drive. It's the drive to sleep. The basic equation is the longer you stay awake, the more sleepy you'll become. And eventually you get to the point where you're very sleepy and you go to sleep and sleepiness dissipates. You can think of it a bit like a pressure valve. Once the pressure is built up, when the pressure is allowed to dissipate, which is what happens during sleep, then it releases, only to be built up again the next day. So that's the first process. But you can see that actually it needs a little bit of tweaking for it to fall within a more regular pattern. That's where the second process comes in. This is called the body clock, or the circadian rhythm, the circadian process. And here we have daylight being the main signal, but we have a body clock rhythm that is pertinent to alertness, to what we call circadian mediated alertness. And you can see that we become more alert throughout the morning until we peak in the middle of our biological day. It may not be 6 o'clock, or in this case, may not be midday. It may be earlier or later, depending on when we get up, depending on when our body clock is, whether we have an earlier body clock, an earlier chronotype, or whether we're a later body clock, a later chronotype. But you see that rhythm sort of balances against or offsets the accrual of sleep pressure that we build during the waking day, such that we're able to stay awake despite being sleepy, gradually getting more and more sleepy. So that circadian rhythm keeps us awake, and it gradually starts to change in the evening or afternoon and evening, and then comes down and down and down, such that we're able to fall asleep. So you see the period just before midnight there, the sleep pressure is very high and the circadian mediated alertness is low, and so the person can fall asleep. If they try to fall asleep at midday, when the sleep pressure isn't high enough and the circadian mediated alertness is too high, then they wouldn't be able to fall asleep, probably. So that's kind of how sleep is regulated. If we think about tips for good sleep, trying to help people optimize their sleep, one of the main things to realize, and it goes back to the first slide we have, is that we evolved to sleep in a very specific way. We evolved to sleep at night, and at night we have 3 characteristics of the nighttime environment which are very different to the daytime environment. And the first one is that it's a lot quieter at night than it is during the day. So if you go outside at night and you compare that to going outside during the day, of course you have human activity, but even animal activity is noisy, and you notice that there's a big difference in terms of how much noise we experience. The second one, and most obvious one probably, is that it's much darker. We have the absence of light, and the importance of light here cannot be understated, cannot be overstated. Light has the strongest signal on our body clock. When we wake up in the morning, it is light exposure in the morning that sets the clock for the rest of the day. And so when we see that the kind of across a period, if you get up at the same time every day, what you do is you give yourself the same stimulant or stimulus for your circadian process in a consistent fashion across that period of time. That helps regularize sleep. But if we live in an environment like the one in which we live here in the UK, where it's dark most of the time during the winter, it's quite bright during the summer occasionally, and we want to kind of maximize that. What we can do is we can make stark differences. So we can have thick curtains to keep out light at night, where light may be problematic, and we can have bright light during the day, particularly on days like today when it's a bit sort of grey and cloudy, as it is down here in Oxford. Not sure how it is in Scotland, but imagine it's not too dissimilar. So the idea is that we try and work with the natural context of the nighttime characteristics. And the third one is temperature. So temperature is something that drops a lot at night in the absence of sunlight. And what happens, interestingly, to the body is that in accordance with our circadian rhythms, we have a core body temperature drop So the body temperature actually reaches its lowest point a couple of hours before you'd wake naturally, if left to sleep to a kind of a natural rhythm. And so what we see is that core temperature minimum is important because it's a circadian marker. It's something before that time, if we get lots of bright light, it's not helpful. After that time, if we get lots of bright light, it's very helpful. It keeps the sleep regular. In fact, it keeps it tight. So allowing, especially in the winter where we turn our heating up, allowing the ambient temperature to drop to about 18 degrees, probably something around that's helpful. There's no absolute number, of course, it's just a suggestion. At night, that's probably a useful place at which to hold the temperature, to allow for your natural drop in body temperature that happens across the sleep period. Having good mattresses, having good bedding is really important too. I know this sounds very obvious, but the number of people I've seen over the years who have spent, lots and lots of money on, say, a great telly that they may sit and watch for an hour an evening, and then they spend nothing on a horrible old mattress that they've had for 20 years with springs poking them in the back. Spend the money where it's going to be, most helpful. Buying a nice mattress. They don't even cost a huge amount these days, but getting a good quality mattress with good bedding and good, appropriately comfortable bedding, warm bedding, whatever it happens to be, that's going to be important for your sleep. And keeping the room tidy, keeping it somewhere that is enjoyable in which to be. So thinking about a bedroom as a place to drop everything, to drop all the concerns, the worries about the day, piles of laundry you haven't done. Not a helpful place to leave it in the bedroom. It just reminds you of stuff you've got to do. So keeping the bedroom a kind of an oasis of calm, an oasis of relaxation, a space where you don't bring any work, you don't bring any of the hassle of the day, is also helpful. Thinking carefully about eating and drinking. We all enjoy, or most of us do anyway, maybe a caffeinated drink during the day. That's something that's quite a British thing for us to do, to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Caffeine has an interesting effect on sleep. What it does is it blocks the ability of the brain to detect sleepiness, that sleep drive, the sleep pressure that we talked about, the first of the two processes. And so if you have caffeine, which may hang around in the body for quite a long time, so the half-life of caffeine, the amount of time it takes for caffeine to reduce by half in the bloodstream, is between 3 and 7 hours. Roughly. So you have quite a lengthy period of time before caffeine is kind of eliminated completely. And if you have a couple of cups of coffee in the morning, 3 cups of coffee in the morning, you say, well, they're all in the morning. What we don't take into account is that that caffeine load then takes longer to be dealt with by the body because there's more of it to get rid of. So thinking about alcohol, alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, so it puts us to sleep very quickly. Some of us may remember from the Christmas period that that's what it does. And one of the things that's important to understand about alcohol is that although it may put us to sleep quickly, it doesn't keep us asleep. In fact, once it's been metabolized, then our sleep architecture changes. And not only does it change, but it's also a diuretic. So it increases our likelihood of needing to go for a pee in the night, which may wake us up and make us feel uncomfortable. And of course, we may be in bed thinking, oh, I don't want to get out of bed because I don't want to have a pee because it's cold, and you get caught up in your mind too. So thinking carefully about when you have a drink, when's the latest you're going to have a drink, if you're noticing that it's a problem. If it's not a problem for you, you knock yourself out, do your thing. But if it is a problem, then just spending some time reflecting on it, thinking carefully about it is helpful. Eating is also something that we want to take into account too. So big heavy meals before bed, again, if they're not a problem for you, you do your thing. But if it is a problem, if you notice that actually you feel uncomfortable, you're not necessarily sleeping as well, maybe moving that meal a little bit earlier, having a lighter meal instead of a heavy meal, or having your main meal, your supper, maybe earlier in the evening and having a snack before bed. These are ways of thinking about how you can change it up a bit to experiment with what works for you. The question I often get asked by, I don't know, when I'm on the radio or something, people say, what's the most helpful thing we can do for our sleep? And it's a difficult one to answer easily and quickly. But what's really clear is if we get up at the same time every day, we give ourselves the best opportunity for regularizing our sleep, for making it consistent. You know, if you get up at different times each day, you have longer and shorter periods of wakefulness. It doesn't kind of lend itself to a particularly predictable pattern. And so what we want to do is remember that light is that primary signal that helps our sleep or helps our circadian rhythm function or entrain to the cycle outside. We want it to be fairly consistent, fairly rhythmical. If you think about where we evolved outside in the African savannah, or for lots of it, you know, nice regular sunrises, regular evenings. We're able to sync to that naturally. That's what our brains do. They've evolved to do. So if we try and mimic that by getting up at the same time every day and letting the other end fall where it may. So when you get sleepy, you go to bed, and you get up at the same time every day. Then you go to bed when you're sleepy again. You've anchored one end of it, and the other end can be a little bit, you know, it's easier to work that way. Much easier to get up at a regular time than it is to go to sleep at a regular time. We can't force ourselves to go to sleep. We can force ourselves to get up. So that's kind of one of the things that I would say is probably most helpful. So here we have an example of essentially a messy rhythm. This is an individual who's getting up at different times, going to bed at different times, and you can see that actually because they're awake, or they're getting into bed, not quite ready for sleep yet, they're awake for a bit, they fall asleep, they have a bit of a period of wakefulness, and then they overshoot when they're getting up. What time is? They eventually have a bit of a lie-in too. It's all a bit arbitrary, it's all a bit ambiguous. If we just told this person, right, cut it here, 6 o'clock, don't get up any later than 6 o'clock, or whatever it is, 6:30, 7 o'clock, whenever you want to schedule it, then we can let that bit that can be one of the bookends, and the other end can be can kind of fall into place of its own accord. But what we want to try and do is make sure that we're getting into bed when we're sleepy and when we're ready for sleep, and we're getting out of bed at a consistent time that's you know, early enough to mean that we keep sleep tight, but not too early so that we cut sleep. We don't want to cut it unnecessarily. So one of the other really important things to mention is keeping the bed just for sleep, making sure that sleep is the main thing with which we associate being in bed. So they always say there's two things you can do in bed, or two things that we can kind of associate bed with. One of them is intimacy with your partner, because it's a practical place to do that kind of thing. And the second thing is sleeping. So if we start to associate bed with other things, such as being awake, or being irritated, or not being able to get to sleep, or you know, worrying about sleep, or working, or eating, or watching telly, or whatever, then the signal, the association, the paired association between being in bed and being asleep starts to crumble. And I can illustrate this with an example of some tennis. So if I said to Sarah, grab a racket, let's head down to the tennis courts. Sarah wouldn't have to think very hard to work out what it is that we were going to go and do on the tennis courts. She would assume, because of the association, that we're going to go to the tennis courts. What do you do on a tennis court? Well, you play tennis, and I've got a tennis racket. So she'd assume we're going to go and play tennis. And of course, she'd be right. However, if I decided in my sort of Machiavellian scientific madness to say, yeah, we're not going to play tennis. Instead, we're going to play hockey, right? Or we're going to course of a week. The next week, I said to Sarah, grab a tennis racket, let's head down to the courts. She wouldn't necessarily be thinking, we're going to go and play tennis. Now she'd be thinking, well, do you know what? I don't know what we're going to do. We might play tennis. We don't really play very much tennis on the courts anymore. We spend time playing hockey, and actually he's been making cakes there too. He's kind of a strange guy. And so the reality is that we've absolutely degraded that relationship between being on the courts and playing tennis. And we've now made it very, very ambiguous, very arbitrary. If we spend time in bed not sleeping, if we spend time in bed being actively frustrated, actively irritated at not sleeping, actively worried about the effects of not sleeping, doing other things as a means of trying to get to sleep, listening to whale sounds or whatever it might be, what we end up doing is we end up associating the bed with that frustration, with that lack of predictability, with that battle, if you like. Bed becomes a battleground, is what some people say. And invariably then, we don't have this strong paired association. So what we often suggest is, if that happens and you notice that you're in bed not asleep. The first thing is to say, if you're not sleepy, don't get into bed. When you're sleepy, you notice you're sleepy, get into bed. If it doesn't happen for whatever reason within a few minutes, if you lie there and it's not happening, you sigh to yourself, gosh, not again, then that's the point at which to get out of bed. And all we do is we go downstairs again, or we go into the living room, we go and sit down in an armchair, snuggly armchair, blankets, pillows, whatever you like, doesn't matter. Read a book, watch a documentary, something that's relaxing. Don't try and sleep, don't try and make yourself sleepy, don't try to do anything. Just enjoy doing whatever it is you're doing, just relax. And in doing so, sleepiness will come back again, and you can go back to sleep when you feel sleepy. So it's a nice little pattern. Feel sleepy, get into bed. If you're not asleep, get out of bed, relax. When you feel sleepy again, get back into bed, and so on and so forth. And what we do in doing this is we retrain ourselves to associate bed with sleep, and we stop ourselves getting caught up in patterns of trying too hard to get to sleep. Napping and exercise are also good ones, because these are things that may have changed over the Christmas period. They certainly changed for me a bit over the Christmas period. Napping during the day is generally a bad idea if you're struggling to get to sleep at night. There are a couple of instances of people with sleep problems for whom napping is a sensible thing to do, but they are for people with particular sleep disorders, not general insomnia or general sleep problems. General sleep problems, what we say is if you nap during the day, you take away the sleep pressure that you need at night. And so if you have a nap and you try to get to sleep later on, you may struggle to get to sleep later on because you haven't got any of that sleep pressure there. So you have to stay up a little bit later. Now, our Mediterranean cousins, they have a little siesta in the middle of the day maybe, but the reason they do that is because often, culturally one would assume it's because it's very hot in the middle of the day, often in those countries, not a very productive period of the day, so you have a little rest, and then you stay up a little bit later in the cool of the evening with your friends and family, and you do your late dinners and stuff and enjoy the cool of the evening. So they've kind of got a different cultural approach to us, but in the UK we don't do that. So napping is not such a great idea during the day. And exercise is one that's interesting too. So very often I hear people saying, I went on a run to try and tire myself out, or I did lots of exercise as a means of trying to make myself sleepy. So tiredness, physical tiredness, lethargy, exhaustion, fatigue, and sleepiness are two different things. And it's very important to differentiate them, because working hard to feel exhausted in terms of activity won't necessarily make you sleepy, and it may even make you more alert, more awake. And so what's important is understanding that if you do your exercise earlier, often in the presence of some sunlight, that's quite a helpful thing to do. Difficult, of course, in this kind of weather, but do it earlier in the day rather than later in the day. That's the general advice. If you do it later in the day and you don't have a problem with your sleep, you do it. Don't worry, no problem at all. But it's if you notice that the exercise is getting in the way of sleep, then probably that's something to change. Another sort of more therapeutic piece, I guess, might be thinking about winding down before bed. So if we think about driving a car, if we were going to slow a car down from 50, 60 miles an hour to zero, to a stop, we wouldn't do that in a meter. You wouldn't be able to do it in a meter. It would be a very big mess, and it would be quite uncomfortable for people. So what we want to do is we gradually decelerate the car as we get towards a stop. And that's the same thing we do at the end of the day. We gradually wind down. Remember, your circadian system's already at play. It's already working. Melatonin is probably starting to be secreted, and you gradually start winding down in terms of your alertness. But mentally, we also want to help ourselves just shut down a bit. So maybe that includes things like relaxation exercises. It might include things like some meditation. It might include things like watching your favorite program on telly to help you laugh and relax, and putting the day to rest. So putting those work laptops away, making sure you've got your phone on no notifications or whatever it is, or putting your phone away, and just enjoying the part of the day that's just for you. And one of the ways in which people often find this helpful to facilitate is to use something called putting the day to rest, which is a technique that Colin SBR, a professor of sleep medicine at the University of Oxford, and one of our chief medical officer at Big Health, kind of talks about it a lot. So we get a journal or a diary or a piece of paper, and earlier in the evening, maybe about 7 o'clock, we note down all the stuff we've got to do for the next day. We make a to-do list for the next day. We be pedantic, we put down everything. So I've got to call so-and-so, and I've got to do it on that number, and I've got to do it with this. I've got this in mind, I've got to talk to them about that, and so on and so forth. And you write it all down, tip all the contents of your head onto that piece of paper, and allow that to hold the weight, the metaphorical weight of all that information. You don't need to hold it anymore. Write it all down, go through it again, be pedantic, add extra bits in if you think it's helpful. And then when you finish doing that, 5 or 10 minutes later, grab your phone, put on an alarm for the next day, and maybe put the alarm on for 8 o'clock in the morning, and make a mental assertion, make a mental note to say, I'm going to come back and deal with this tomorrow at 8 o'clock. When the phone goes off at 8 o'clock, I'll come back and deal with everything that's on this piece of paper. But until that point, I'm going to rest. I'm not going to deal with any of it. And if any of your thoughts come up in the run up to sleep, you can put them down on the piece of paper. That's fine. You can go and add to the piece of paper, but we're not taking off the piece of paper. We're just putting on the piece of paper. And of course, the next day at 8 o'clock, you can sit down and you've got it all laid out there for you to follow. So another option for those of you with difficulty with sleep is what we're very pleased to say is now available to everyone in Scotland, and that's Sleepio. So Sleepio is digital CBT for insomnia, cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia, and it's something that is available to you through the internet, so you can access it. I'll put the link at the end of the. I've got the link at the end of the slides. It's essentially what you'd experience doing face-to-face therapy for insomnia, but done through a virtual therapist, the prof who's there on the screen there with the dog. And the idea is that this provides the evidence-based first-line recommended treatment for insomnia to people through their computers, and we found it to be very effective. So it's been through 12 randomized control trials to date, but it's also something that is built upon a very robust evidence base in terms of the CBT approach itself. It's something we've used in over 100,000 people now, so been offered to 100,000 people in the UK, so it's been used by a lot of people. It doesn't have any waiting time, you can access it straight away, it's safe, it's trusted. And so it's something that I really recommend you investigate if sleep is still problematic for you. One of the ways in which you can kind of access it is to go to this website. There'll be a link at the end, and you have a sleep score generated. So what you do is you answer a couple of questions on how your sleep is, and your sleep report is given to you by the program. So it makes sense of your sleep, and the program is then tailored to your needs. So you start these 6 weekly sessions, which you can do, and you can do them on your computer. You don't have to do them on a phone, although you can also access some of the stuff on your phone. And you immediately begin to put into practice the principles of CBT for insomnia with a view to changing your sleep. So here are some of the tips that we've been through today. So the idea mainly here is to keep a regular rise time and to keep sleep as consistent as possible. Get up at the same time every day, keep a routine that's roughly the same, keep the bed and bedroom dedicated to sleep, develop a wind down routine to help sleep happen effortlessly, and protect sleep from competing demands. So get that mobile phone out of the bedroom, also get that work laptop off the chest of drawers. We want to make sure that this is something that is just, you don't have to have any intrusions from working life when you get into bed. Keep sleep healthy by being active during the day. So lots of activity during the day is good. Dynamic daytime activity is a good predictor of sleep. And keep sleep for the night time. Don't nap during the day, because it's likely to steal away sleep pressure from the time you need it at the end of the day. And keep sleep the same on weekends and weekdays. Remember this: the body doesn't have an idea of what a weekend or a weekday is. If you need to lie in on the weekends, it's probably because you're not getting enough sleep during the week. So maybe try and get better sleep during the week. Improve the amount of sleep you're giving yourself, the opportunity you're giving yourself for sleep during the week, such that on a weekend you don't have to sleep in too long. And if you're still struggling with your sleep, then try cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia delivered by Sleepio. And the two QR codes are here for Sleepio, and for Sleepio's sister program, Daylight, which is very similar, but seeks to help people with anxiety. So particularly with mild to moderate symptoms of generalized anxiety. But again, evidence-based digital therapeutic, highly recommended, and it's something that you can access as an app. So Daylight is something that provides CBT for anxiety on your phone as and when you need it, to help you when you need it in situations in which it arises. And Sleepio is more of a course of treatment that you can access on your computer. That's all from me. I'll just stop the slideshow, but very happy to answer some questions if there are any. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Dimitri. My name's Dan Cudmore. I'm the UK engagement lead at Big Health. I'm just going to ask Jenna and Sarah if they can pass through any questions onto the Q&A. I'm sure we've been getting a few. I will keep an eye out for that. But if anyone has got any questions that they haven't posted, please pop them in the Q&A now, and we'll put them to Dimitri. So anything kind of sleep or anxiety related, please pop them in the Q&A, and I'm sure Jen and Sarah can pass them through to us now. We've got one straight away, Dimitri. So there's a few. So do you have any advice for coping with sleep issues when the soundproofing is not very good? You might be able to hear your neighbours or other stuff going on outside.
So this is a really, really good question, and it's not one that has, it's a really practical question, isn't it? And I struggle with being a light sleeper. So I'm in a house with two small children, a 5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. I've got my wife, and we've got our family dog as well. And so we're all, moving around in bed. We've all got, sometimes people pops the loo in the middle of the night. We live in an urban street, so we have people walking past the house. We have foxes making noises outside, owls sometimes, trains passing, planes sometimes. Things wake you up. Neighbors, again, just another one of those things that happen. If they're really, really raucous and if they're causing a lot of problems, then without wishing to be overly obvious about it, then having a chat with them might be a good idea. And if need be, looking to chat to someone at the council if it's really that problematic. But if it's just general general noise and it's not really something that's that serious, but you're finding it difficult, then there's absolutely no harm in trying things like earplugs. I don't have any kind of magic formula for it, because this is an everyday problem. But I use a pair of earplugs it's a very squishy foam earplug. Works brilliantly for me. Helps me sleep really well. Ideally it'd be great not to have them, but I find it helpful for me. I don't think it's a big deal. If I don't have them, I still sleep okay. But the idea is that it just kind of takes the edge off a bit. Another thing that might be helpful if you're noticing that this is something that's impacting your ability to sleep even with earplugs, you could put maybe some white noise on just to kind of dampen the sound a bit. And there are lots of white noise apps out there that provide consistent white noise throughout the night. White noise is not a treatment for insomnia, bear in mind. There was a review done, I think last year, that published results looking at the literature and found that white noise wasn't a cure for insomnia, but we're not using it as a cure for insomnia here. We're using it as a means of dampening the noise level in an environment where noise is impacting on someone's ability to sleep. So a couple of practical suggestions there. I'm not sure how helpful they are, but I hope it's of some help. It is a problem for lots of us living. If we live with other people, if we live around other people, which of course most of us do, then we're bound to be disturbed by them in some way, shape or form.
Thanks, Dimitri. A really useful answer, some practical things there for sure. I can see this one's got a few likes, so I'm gonna tackle that one next. A few people putting thumbs up, maybe experiencing the same. So someone says that they're waking up every few hours, so maybe not getting their full 7 to 8, 9 hours, they might use hypnosis or something to get them off to sleep. But are there any tips for for someone who's waking in the night throughout the night?
Great question, and so there's a couple of things to think about here. So the first one is that, remember, we all wake up at night, all of us, multiple times during the night. We come up into wakefulness and we go back down into sleep. That is not a problem in itself. Brief awakenings throughout the night are not a problem. When they start to impact on your ability to get a continuous night's sleep, so you're awake for, say, an hour at a time, or you're really struggling to get back to sleep, or you're becoming irritated or upset about being awake at night, which is understandable, or when they are when they're the result of something else. So it could be that you wake as a result of feeling breathless, or it could be that you wake as a result of discomfort in your limbs. Those last two things, physical symptomatology, that might be a sign of a sleep disorder, something like obstructive sleep apnea in the first example. In the second example, maybe a periodic limb movement or a restless leg syndrome or something like that. If that's the case, then those physical symptoms require further investigation with beginning with your GP, but then with specialists afterwards. If you're waking frequently throughout the night and you're finding it difficult to get back to sleep because you're just on edge, or you're trying, one of the things to bear in mind is that the harder we try, the irony is the cruelest of ironies. It's just very, very cruel. But the harder we try to get to sleep, the more difficult it is to get to sleep. Physiologically, we are hardwired to pick up on threat, to pick up on potential danger, and to then for our physiology to then change to deal with that danger, to mitigate that danger. It's called the fight or flight response, the acute stress response. If we dial it back to cave people times, you see the saber-toothed cat, you immediately don't feel sleepy anymore. Say it's happening at night, you're just about to go to sleep with your family, you hear a roar outside, immediately you stand up, you grab a spear, you run to the front of the cave, and you're ready to fight off the predator. Now, that's fine and good in that example, or the dramatic example, but if we think about how that impacts us during the night, when we're struggling to get back to sleep, the threat is no longer a saber-toothed cat, but the threat is, what if I can't get back to sleep? Or maybe the threat is even more subtle. Maybe the threat is just, I'm not sleeping and this is irritating me. Even if it's, some people say to me, but I'm really relaxed when it happens. But the fact that you're aware of the fact that you're not sleeping is enough to just cause you a little level of being kind of slightly on edge. And that is enough to irritate you into wakefulness. So there are a couple of techniques which might be helpful for people. I think the most helpful thing to do is to suggest people go and use Sleepio, which we've just spoken about earlier, because Sleepio has a range of different things that will be helpful for a range of different people. But there are some things that people might find helpful in the short term. So, or not in the short term, but kind of putting it into practice tonight. And one of these is called paradoxical intention. So paradoxical intention is illustrated best by the example of my parents-in-law. So my parents-in-law come and sit on the sofa watching telly, and very often when they're watching telly, one will slump forward and snore like this, and then one will have their head back and snore like that. And they'll both be watching telly, or not watching telly. But when you ask them, what's happened, they'll both say, we're watching telly, we're trying to watch telly. What they're doing is they're trying to stay awake to watch the television, whatever they're watching. But because they're sleepy, right, because their bodies are sleepy, and actually as you get older, your body clock becomes earlier, so you go to sleep a little bit earlier. There is truth to that stereotype. But as you try to pay attention to the TV and you're really tired, you end up just nodding off, because you're not trying to chase sleep. You're trying to chase wakefulness. You're being alert and attentive, or trying to be, and you're fighting this trying to stay awake, just trying to stay awake. And so what happens is sleep overtakes you. A very a sad corollary of this is road traffic accidents when people are sleepy. They try to stay awake to keep going, and because they're so tired, they're so sleepy, sleep overwhelms them, they have an accident. In this sense, the more we run towards sleep, the more unhelpful it is, the more we experience that anxiety, that anticipatory anxiety, performance anxiety, we call it in the jargon. And that triggers that sense of not being able to get to sleep. So the best thing to do to try to get to sleep is not to try to get to sleep. So one of the things we recommend is what I mentioned earlier, which is getting out of bed and going and doing something relaxing. But before you get to that stage, one of the things you can try is something we call paradoxical intention. So paradoxical intention is what the Americans call reverse psychology. But you see in all the sitcoms, they talk about reverse psychology. But paradoxical intention is, maybe one example might be lying there in bed and lying stock still, not doing anything, closing your eyes, and instead of trying to get to sleep, trying to make yourself sleep, just try desperately to stay awake. I know it sounds a bit silly, this might sound very facile, but give it a go. Lying there, don't move, and just try and stay awake. I've just got to stay awake for another couple of minutes. I'm just going to try and stay awake. I'm just going to try and stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. And just keep repeating to yourself, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, or whatever it happens to be. And that's quite a boring, repetitive, exhaustive process. And if you're sleepy, it may well induce sleep. Another thing you can try maybe is a relaxation exercise, something like a mindful body scan. So if you've not come across a mindful body scan before, then that's something you can look up online. There's plenty of examples of it out there, where we gradually sweep through the body with mindfulness, noticing the sensations within the body. Again, it's a very relaxing activity, but it's one that's quite active. You're having to try to be aware of what's there in the body. And so you're actively trying to stay awake to do so. And if you're tired, because you're actively trying to stay awake, very often it puts you to sleep. That's not the intent of the practice, but it is a kind of helpful side effect in this case. But there are other things too that people can do. But one of the things that Sleepio shows, for those of you who are going to go on and do Sleepio, is that if you get out of bed and go and do something relaxing, have your dressing gown ready, predict that this is going to happen. If it happens every night, say to yourself, right, it's going to definitely happen tonight for sure. Let me put my dressing gown on the end of the bed and have my slippers ready. I'll go down to the armchair in the sitting room. I'll make sure there's a couple of pillows there. I've got a blanket there. I'll make it a nest. That's what I call it. To my patients always say, make a nest. And grab yourself a nice, maybe it's a decaf tea, or maybe it's a hot cocoa or whatever it is. Put it in a thermos ready. Get your favorite book, put it there. Maybe have the remote control for the telly ready and waiting for you. So when you feel this, oh God, it's not happening again, get out of bed, go to the nest and relax. Don't try to go to sleep. Don't even think about sleep. Don't even get involved with the thought about sleep. Just sit there and relax. Watch telly, read a book, drink a cup of tea, a cup of decaf tea, or herbal tea is probably better. And in doing so, what you give yourself the opportunity to do is to relax, to let go of the anxiety, the stress, the irritation, the frustration around not being able to get to sleep. And then sleepiness may come back. And when it comes back and you start reading that second sentence in the chapter again, you kind of go, oh, I have to start again. And you notice you're tired, your eyes are stinging, you close the book, you head back upstairs and you go back and lie down in bed and see what happens. And you just repeat that. That's what's called stimulus control. It's a very important part of CBT for insomnia. So there's a couple of ideas there. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Dimitri. Really helpful. We're getting a lot of questions, so guys, we'll get to as many as possible. There's a couple that are cropping up quite a lot. One I'm just going to tackle very quickly, and the question is Sleepio only available to NHS staff? And the answer is no. If you're a Scotland resident, you can access Sleepio at no cost. All you have to do is enter, I believe, the first half of your postcode when you're going to sign up. Yeah. And that should give you access. So Sleepio is available to the whole of Scotland, and Daylight is too, as Dimitri's already mentioned. So Dimitri, back to some questions for you. I think one that's cropping up a lot is shift workers, and I know we get this often. But is there any specific advice for shift workers around sleep, and maybe some resources you could point them to?
So great question, and absolutely tip-top importance, shift work. Worth bearing in mind that we've done a webinar on shift work already, and so there'll be lots of resources and things there too. So I want to signpost people to that on the National Wellbeing Hub. But in terms of shift work, one of the things to understand with shift work is that it's a big topic, and I really recommend watching the recorded webinar if you can stomach watching me again. But one of the things to understand about shift work is that we're primed to sleep at night, and we're not primed to move our sleep around. That's not what we do naturally. So we have this natural predisposition to do something in a particular way. When we start to move it around a bit, it can of course create problems with our sleep, and that's not a sign that anyone is in any way broken and or sort of weak or problematic. You know, that's a sign that they're working fine. It's just that the kind of artificial nature of sleep shift work is getting in the way. So one of the things that we have to start with understanding is what the nature of the problem is. For some people with shift work problems, it's about staying awake at night. And if you're a late type, if you're a later type, a night owl as we call them, then night shifts are probably easier for you than people who are morning types. In fact, we know that from the literature that late types, naturally late people, often do really well on night shifts versus people who are morning types or kind of intermediate types. Like I'm probably an early intermediate type. And so when thinking about shifts, if you can choose shifts, difficult to do, but if you can choose shifts that are in line with your chronotype, that might be helpful. The second thing is to say that the worst thing that you can do with shifts is to try and sort of artificially prop up things like your wakefulness during the shift with things that will then affect you when you get back home. So lots of caffeine and Red Bull and all kinds of stuff as a means of keeping you awake during the shift is probably going to be less helpful if done, particularly at the end of the shift. That if you do maybe a little bit before you go on shift in the evening, that might be helpful. But when you get back home, you want it to have been plenty of time such that the effects of the caffeine can have been dealt with, metabolized, really have the molecule metabolized. But the other thing to bear in mind is that you can also use stimulants like light. So light is a very potent alerting mechanism, and having brief naps. You know, if you can it's difficult to do it in an NHS setting. There are some NHS settings that may allow for this, but by and large, it's not something that's been adopted. Having brief naps, recovery naps, during the course of a shift, maybe of only 20 minutes, can be a very helpful way of maintaining alertness. Once you get home, or once you're on your way home from a night shift, then reducing the effects of, the first thing to do is make sure that when you travel, you're traveling safely. That's the most important thing to say. The likelihood is that you'll be very sleep deprived by that stage because you'll have done it over numerous nights, and driving home will be, you want to do it slowly, carefully, safely. I won't go too much into that, but also making sure you minimize the effects of bright light in the morning on your going home. So bright light, driving home in the morning, bright light hitting you in the eye, that's not going to be helpful because it has an alerting effect. So what we want to try and do is keep it dim, keep it dark. When you get inside and you get home, best thing to do is take public transport, but you can get home, it's not really practical, but then keep the room dark, a little bit of a wind down, see if you can relax before getting into bed, do your wind down as you do normally. And then once you've got into bed, make sure that the curtains are completely closed, blackout blinds, so on and so forth. Do not disturb signs on the door, maybe earplugs or white noise to try and drown out the sounds of the day. Make sure that this is the night. Make sure it's as much like the night as possible. It's really hard. It is really, really, really hard. There are no quick fixes, quick, easy fixes. But these are kind of ideas that you can play with. And as I say in the webinar we did on shift work, there may be more information there. Other things that can be helpful can be thinking about the way in which you partition sleep. So maybe you have a block of sleep to begin with. You allow for that circadian middle of the day effect where you won't be able to sleep, and then you have another nap before you go on your shift. Which might be another way of dealing with it. So there are ways and ways, but part of what I think is really important to say is don't forget that this isn't when it's shift work, it's not all about sleep. It's also about how you function within your family, the time you spend with your kids, with your loved ones. the time you get to socialize. All of these things change when you're on a shift work pattern. And so it's important to start bearing that sort of stuff in mind too. Where am I getting that from, in addition to when I'm getting my sleep?
Thanks, Dimitri. Really, really helpful advice. And yeah, absolutely. Please do look at the National Wellbeing Hub for the previous shift work webinar. Hopefully that goes into a lot more depth than we've been able to today. So Dimitri, just conscious of time, so I'm gonna say one more, and if we can do it within a couple of minutes, we'll give everyone a chance to grab a brew before they get to their next meeting, or maybe catch some lunch. So something that's come up quite a lot in the chat is melatonin.
Yeah.
And whether it's GPs maybe being reluctant to prescribe it in some people's experience, or just asking generally, whether melatonin supplements are worthwhile. I don't know if you could just talk very briefly about that, Dimitri.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, and I'll try and do it in 2 minutes. So melatonin is a naturally occurring hormone that's secreted by the pineal gland that's in the brain, back of the brain here, and it's something that is secreted in the absence of light. So when we have light hitting the eye, it turns the secretion tap off, and when it's dark, it starts to be secreted again. That pattern is governed by a circadian rhythm. Okay, so that's important. The idea that melatonin as a supplement is necessary to fall asleep is something else. So that process happens for most of us. There's very few people with specific, often with things like neurodevelopmental disorders or various other things that are going on. It may not happen in exactly the right way. Maybe for some older people, it might not happen in exactly the way I've just described. But by and large, it happens fine. And a supplement, or a kind of an artificial synthesized version of melatonin, is not actually necessary. It's not something that will have much of an effect on their ability to sleep. Melatonin only has a very mild hypnotic effect. It's not a sleeping pill in the same way as some of these other heavy sleeping pills are. And the likelihood is that what's best dealt with first is the behavioral and the cognitive stuff before looking at melatonin. So GPs are reluctant to prescribe it for various reasons, but principally because it's not indicated for the treatment of insomnia in general adult care. So I hope that's kind of succinct enough. It has a role. Of course, your brains produce it already, but the stuff that you get in a pill is of a very different caliber. You've got much more going on in your brain already than there is in any kind of pill.
Thanks, Dimitri. Very helpful. So with 1 minute remaining, I think all that's left for me to do is to say thank you, Dimitri, for all of your insight. I can see lots of comments coming through in the chat to say thank you. Very helpful. People might go and check out Sleepio or Daylight. So yeah, thanks so much, Dimitri.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. And sleep well. Wishing you all well. Wishing you a happy new year. And do check out Sleepio and Daylight. We're so pleased that people have access to them now in Scotland. It's the vanguard of the UK, really, because this is what's happening. It's happening in Scotland first. So it's fantastic. Make use of them. They're great programs. And wishing you all the very best.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dimitri. Thanks, everyone. Take care.